Good morning. I just want to talk a little bit this morning about ensiling corn silage, with a particular focus on preventing aerobic spoilage in corn silage. So I just want to talk a little bit, as I say, about harvesting and ensiling corn. When's the best time to harvest? And then also look about and explain what aerobic stability is, and then look also at how we can mitigate aerobic stability and aerobic spoilage in our silage. So what I've got here is a slightly busy side, but if you look here, what I'm trying to show is the optimum ensiling dry matter for corn silage. We recommend that you ensile corn between 30 and 35% dry matter. And the reason for this is it's a slight compromise between the digestibility and content of starch and the digestibility of the NDF, the fiber content of the starch, of the forage itself. So the target dry matter, as I can show on the top here, you can see starch will increase in your maize all the way up to a dry matter of about 38 to 40%. But as we increase the starch content, the digestibility of the fiber in your corn will decrease. So we're aiming now for somewhere in the region of 30 to 35%. So we get the best of both of these worlds when we ensile our product. So if we harvest too early, if we got too wet a crop, then we're looking at low starch, which is going to be lower energy. We'll get a bigger fermentation in a wetter crop, so you'll maybe have excess acid in your silage. And you also then run the risk of getting some effluent, which is essentially losses from your corn crop. If you harvest too late, if it gets too dry, too mature, we then risk low starch and fiber digestibility. And also then you will suppress the fermentation. Drier crops won't ferment as well as a wetter crop. You also then can run into difficulties with compaction of your crop. So if you can't compact the crop, you will leave air inside, which will cause you problems with both the fermentation and then at the tail end when you open with aerobic spoilage. Okay. So talk a bit about good ensiling practice for corn. So the first, a quick comment on the processing. You must process your corn properly. So if you have whole kernels, obviously in your crop, this will pass straight through an animal. It's important that these kernels are processed properly to allow access to the high energy starch of the product. But I want to focus on the aerobic spoilage aspects of ensiling corn. So as I say, this crop can be vulnerable to aerobic spoilage. Now, what do I mean when I say aerobic spoilage? So when silage is heating on exposure to air, this is what we're talking about when we talk about aerobic spoilage. You wind up with crops which look a lot like this. They go dark, they grow visible molds in them, and they become unpalatable to feeding. So almost invariably, yeasts in your silage will initiate aerobic spoilage. So yeasts can tolerate, they can survive the acidic conditions when you ensile your crop. So even though we're bringing the pH down low, some yeasts will survive within your silage forage crop. Okay. Now, these yeasts will break down some of the lactic acid. Lactic acid is a good silage acid. Yeast will take that away, and what that does is to increase the pH of your silage. A yeast activity will also generate the heat that you would associate with aerobic spoilage. Now, when you take away some of this lactic acid, the pH rises. That's when you will start getting molds growing into your silage. And again, if you allow molds to go in your silage, there's a risk then of mycotoxins being introduced into your feed, which will again impact on performance. Okay. And the other thing is that if you're getting heating, if you see heat in your silage, that represents high dry matter and energy losses in your crops. Okay, so it's really important that we control the yeast numbers to prevent that heating, to maximize the quality of the crop. So again, to return to some good practices for preventing aerobic spoilage. Preventing air, keeping oxygen out of your clamp is critical, both to the fermentation and to the aerobic stability of that crop. Okay, so it's important to make a thorough compaction of the crop as best you can. Now, practically, modern harvesters can bring corn into the clamp really very quickly. And if you're bringing lots of material in, it can be a rush to get this stuff compacted properly, to consolidate it properly in the clamp. We should be aiming to consolidate layers no more than 15 centimeters to make sure that that's compacted down well in your bunker. And also then to make sure you have sufficient weight of tractor in the clamp to compress this crop properly. So the more you compress it, the less oxygen will remain in your clamp. Okay, and then sealing the clamp is also incredibly important. Having suppressed it, squeezed out as much of the oxygen as you can, it's important to seal that to prevent oxygen coming back into the clamp. So side sheeting on clamps is extremely important, and also would promote the use of an oxygen barrier. Again, the top surface is very vulnerable to spoilage. An oxygen barrier is a very good way of keeping air away from that crop and preserving the very top layers of the crop as well. And of course, weighting the clamp to make sure that compaction is maintained, the sheeting stays down, that's also very important. So I just want to show some results from a recent study in Germany who've been looking at both air introduction at the beginning of ensiling and also then repeated introduction of air throughout the ensiling process. So these two things impact your ensiling process in a slightly different way. Okay? So if we look at sealing quickly or sealing in a late fashion, so delaying sealing for 24 hours after packing your clamp. Now, this graph on the top is showing dry matter losses. So here I've got prompt sealing, so we're sealing immediately after the crop is into the silo. And on this side, there was delayed sealing. So there was a 24-hour period where we haven't got sheeting on the clamp. And there's a clear difference here in the dry matter losses between the two. Okay? So if you leave the crop, if you delay the closing of this silo, the dry matter losses are increased almost twice or more than twice. Okay, so allowing oxygen to be present in that clamp at the beginning of the fermentation allows yeast activity, and you will see very significant dry matter losses. So it is really important that you seal these clamps as quickly as is possible after getting the crop inside. Okay, and then the graph on the bottom here is looking at then introducing air to a clamp which has already been sealed. Okay, so for instance, if you get damage to the surfaces and allow air to get back into the crop. And what you can see here, so air ingress is less important to the fermentation losses, but it has a very big impact on aerobic stability. So if you allow air back into your silo, that will allow yeast activity to grow up, and that will then result in silage which is more vulnerable to heating. Okay, so again, what we're looking now is to prevent that yeast activity to stop this spoilage. I just want to look quickly now at the consequences of feeding spoiled silage. So I'm saying it's important to prevent spoilage, and this is why. Okay, so I've got two figures here. One is a graph on the right hand side looking at dry matter intakes of your crop, and this is the temperature of the silage. So as you get yeast activity, silage will heat up. It's a spoiling silage. So the more heat, the more your silage is spoiling. And there's a very clear trend here between dry matter intake and spoiling. Okay, so dry matter intake will decrease significantly if you allow this forage to spoil. Okay, and similarly here, this was a study in goats, I think, but this is a study in beef cattle, and the same trend is what we're seeing here. If you feed, this is the percentage of spoiled silage in the ration. If you feed this material, this dark spoiled material, then it will impact on dry matter intakes, and if you're reducing intakes, you will impact on performance. Okay, so this is why it's so important to prevent aerobic spoilage. So what I want to look at now is how you can use an inoculant as part. So we talked about keeping air out. That's very important. But you can also target yeasts directly, either by using an inoculant, a biological inoculant, to generate acetic acid. So acetic acid is a potent inhibitor of yeasts. You could also include an acid in your silage. So something, for instance, potassium sorbate is again a potent inhibitor of yeasts. So again, this is just a graph demonstrating how important it is to control yeast. This is the relationship between yeasts, low to high, and then the aerobic stability in hours. So as you increase this yeast count, the aerobic stability is reduced very, very quickly if you allow yeast numbers to get up to high levels. So I just want to look now at a couple of products that we have available in the Ecosyl range. So the first one is the Ecosyl product. This is a biological. It contains 2 bacteria to improve your fermentation of your maize. So the first one is in there to target the yeasts in your sample. So this is a Lactobacillus buttneri at strain PJB1. Now this is going to generate acetic acid within the fermentation, which will stop yeast activity throughout the process. It also contains a strain of Lactobacillus plantarum, as this strain MTD1, and this is probably the most trialed, tested silage inoculant strain on the market. Okay, so we have a huge amount of data behind MTD1 to show that it's driving animal performance, be that milk or meat, live weight gain. Okay, so all of our Ecosyl range is underpinned by MTD1. The other product range I'll talk about is the double action range. So this targets aerobic spoilage by using potassium sorbate. So there's potassium sorbate salt in there, and that will inhibit yeasts similar to the way that acetic acid does with Ecocool. Okay. And just finally, I want to show just a quick example of how Ecocool is working. Okay, so I've got a few figures here to show you what's happening in a silage fermentation. So if we look at this graph on the top, this is a maize crop which has been treated either with Ecocool or left untreated. So there's no treatment with this one. And you can see straight away, if we're talking about generating acetic acid to stabilize our crop, there is some acetic acid in the untreated silage, but there is much more in that Ecocool treated silage. Okay, so we would expect this difference to have an impact on the yeast levels that are present in the silage. And we can see that that's exactly what's happened. So we couldn't find any yeasts in this Ecocool silage after 3 months of ensiling. There were at least 100 times more yeasts present in that untreated silage. Now that difference in yeast numbers we would expect to see impact on the aerobic stability in the forage. And that's exactly what's happened here. So what we're measuring here is the temperature of your silage over time. And you can see there's a big spike in the temperature of this untreated forage after about 2 days. And that's because of this yeast activity. You're seeing silage beginning to heat, whereas the Ecocool silage here is remaining absolutely stable. So there's no heating in that Ecocool silage for more than 10 days. Okay, so that Ecocool silage was very, very stable. Okay. So just to wrap up, to summarize briefly, as I say, maize is a high energy crop. You can use it to drive performance, but you have to bank the potential of that crop. Okay, if you don't ensile it properly, you will lose it, you will be losing dry matter, and you will lose performance. Okay, it requires a careful management to maximize the return from this crop. So, as I say, excluding oxygen is extremely important, and that's a practical on-farm management practice. But also the use of a proven inoculant can promote aerobic stability by directly targeting those yeasts. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay.
So, Mark, what is the impact of the animal health by feeding bad silage? What will that do to that?
I mean, it depends. Depressing intake is one of the, so performance-wise, that's a problem. Okay, so if you're allowing your silage to spoil, then the quality is going to drop, and then you're essentially be able to feed less of a lower quality product. So that's a problem. But then if you've got molding silage as well, then you're at risk potentially of mycotoxin damage as well. So you want to avoid molds growing in your silage just because you might be introducing mycotoxins into the ration.